Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. This month we're doing something a little different and celebrating the holidays with Tinsley's 1869 Christmas Annual. This is a series of videos that will roll out over the next few weeks telling a single story. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, use the link on screen or in the description below to watch it. It provides the context for everything that follows. In summary, a rich old man has died and sent letters to a group of people who will inherit a share of his wealth if they can attend a dinner in person. Each individual story in the series goes on to describe one of the letter recipients and their journey, and they are all dramatically different and fascinating. So now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Of the first old lady who traveled with a ghost. Are you going to let him have this credit, Rachel? I was thinking about it. Thinking about it? I don't see that it requires much thought. It's a simple question of yes or no. Well, yes, then. Then you'll regret it every day of your life. I don't see how. The deuce you don't! But I tell you, you will. You are prejudiced, Stephen. The boy seems honest and sincere enough. Seems, does he? With his nasty canting ways. I tell you what it is, Rachel, there's not a drop of honest English blood in him, the deceitful sneak. If I were you, Stephen Earnshaw, I wouldn't speak so of my own flesh and blood. It isn't creditable. He couldn't help his mother making a fool of herself and marrying a Frenchman. The lad's our own nephew, say what you will about it. That's no reason he should ruin us. He isn't going to ruin us. He will, if you let him go on as he is doing. I don't believe it. But you never liked him from the beginning. No, I didn't, and I never shall. Then more shame to you. Old Mrs. Earnshaw was vexed and angry. Her brother-in-law, Stephen Earnshaw, was vexed and angry, and the cause of their mutual annoyance was Louis Delbar, their nephew, Mrs. Earnshaw's protégé. He was the son of her late husband's sister, who, when a pretty girl of 17, had eloped with a Frenchman and had never been heard of till her sole representative, M. Louis, turned up one fine day at Earnshaw Nest and startled the quiet inmates by claiming a relationship with them. He stated that his father and mother had both been dead some years, that he had been employed in a mercantile house in Lyon, but, falling into pecuniary difficulties, had been obliged to relinquish his situation and to come over to England, in the hope that some of his mother's rich relations would do something for him. His story was plausible, his deportment pleasing and elegant, and old Mrs. Earnshaw, who had no children of her own, felt her heart warm toward the fascinating young Frenchman who quickly ingratiated himself into her good graces by his politeness and deference to her wishes. Louis Delbar impressed everyone who saw him with a favorable opinion. His free, frank manners, his gay, insouciant bearing, won the esteem of all except Stephen Earnshaw, his own uncle. This man, now well on in years, had for some time managed the estate of his rich sister-in-law as a sort of steward, besides superintending to a great extent the wholesale house of business in London, from which she derived most of her revenue. He was her factotum and general adviser, her servant and yet her friend. His language was very bluff at times, for he never disguised his feelings in any way, and he set his face from the first against the young man, whom he designated as an adventurer, as a French spy, or agent of some secret society. Not all the efforts of Louis Delbar could ever win more than a grunt from the stubborn old Englishman, who expressed in no measured terms his unconcealed aversion to the young Frenchman's ways and conduct. He possessed the good old-fashioned dislike to smoking, and when on some occasions he had met Louis coming out of a billiard saloon, accompanied by a man of anything but reputable character, he at once acquainted Mrs. Earnshaw with the fact, warning her against the danger she incurred by having such a man about the house. Louis, however, told his version of the affair, representing matters in such a way that Mrs. Earnshaw believed her brother-in-law was in reality jealous of his foreign nephew, and only wanted to set her against him in order to have him out of the way. Mrs. Earnshaw was obstinate, however. All old women are. She had taken a fancy, and she didn't mean to let a trifle interfere with it. Delbar tried all he could to dispel the suspicions of his uncle. He proved his willingness to work by imploring Mrs. Earnshaw to give him any situation she chose, and expressed his determination never to be dependent on her bounty, but to earn for himself his own position. On more than one occasion he gave ample proof of his energy and activity, and the heart of the good old lady was touched by his evident anxiety to please her. But he could not please Stephen Earnshaw. He bore with his cross, crotchety ways, consulted him on all occasions, laughed at his cool sarcasms as though they were simply jeux d'esprit that called for his admiration, yet, try as he might, he couldn't conciliate the old man, who never gave him a civil answer if he could possibly help it, but alternately watched and avoided him, and had always something disagreeable to oppose to all his schemes. Poor Mrs. Earnshaw didn't lead an easy life between the pair, whom she gladly would have seen friends. Stephen, her friend and counselor, was as necessary to her as her own existence. Never an angry word had passed between them till the advent of the young foreigner. And now Stephen was morose and taciturn, while Mrs. Earnshaw showed she was still mistress of the firm by her determination not to discard her nephew at any cost. Certainly she seemed to have justice on her side. No evil or treachery could possibly lurk behind the honest, open brow, the laughing blue eyes of Louis Delbar, no perfidy in the soft, sweet tones of that low, trianante voice, the warm, flexile grasp of those small, slender fingers. There were those who said that when the Frenchman thought himself alone, a black scowl rested on his usually smooth forehead, a lurid light crept into his glittering eyes, and his long, lithe fingers laced and interlaced as though they grasped something unseen. These were but the disordered imaginations of those whose minds were warped by the prejudices and opinions of his uncle, whose rough, ungenial manners had nothing in common with the delicate, refined politeness of the Frenchman. So, Louis Delbar held his own, and was promoted to the post of confidential clerk in the firm of Earnshaw and Company, wholesale merchants of Cannon Street, City. He soon proved he was not undeserving the trust reposed in him. By his pleasing address and punctuality he won the confidence of many substantial men, while his ample knowledge of business in regard to foreign relations, and his facility in foreign correspondence, being acquainted with 2 or 3 languages beside his own, made him a great acquisition. Mrs. Earnshaw was delighted. The connection was extended, funds flowed in from all quarters, while Louis Delbar, never appearing to presume on his talent, remained nearly always in town, pleading that anxiety about business kept him from Earnshaw Nest. Stephen Earnshaw heard some rumors about race-horses, and a pretty ballet girl kept a short distance from town, but he failed to prove anything against his nephew. The managers reported him diligent and attentive. Reading, the nearest station to Earnshaw Nest, was a long way out of town, and the surly old yeoman was obliged to content himself with growling whenever he returned from a visit to the house in London, or whenever Louis ventured down there. So things continued for some considerable time, when M. Delbar arrived in great haste to consult his aunt as to the advisability of giving a large amount of credit to a firm in Lyons, with whom they had already had some very extensive dealings. Louis first introduced the firm to their notice, having been acquainted with it when he was in Lyons. He represented it as doing by far the largest trade in that mercantile city, and declared that the giving of large and long credit to such a firm must result in their own advantage. Stephen Earnshaw opposed him strenuously. They had connection enough, he said, with English houses without seeking to extend it, and he objected vehemently to any further risk being run. The dispute ended in a tiff between him and his sister-in-law, while Louis, who for the first time threw out a hint that the old man had some stronger motive in the background for his opposition, returned to London, master of the situation. A month afterwards, the house of Earnshaw was again in confusion. A telegram arrived to the effect that the firm in Lyons had failed, leaving them debtors to the amount of £20,000. The panic this caused can be more easily imagined than described. Old Mrs. Earnshaw took to her bed. Stephen swore, stormed, and fumed, while young Delbar seemed overwhelmed with grief, especially as he was the cause of so much credit being given so short a time before the failure. They never retrieved the damage. Unable to meet the demands of their own creditors, and obliged to beg for time, thereby losing the confidence of their customers, the house of Earnshaw and Company went slowly but surely to the bad. Mrs. Earnshaw sold her estate and went to live in a small house at Camberwell. She retrenched in every way she could, but it was with great difficulty, so Louis stated, that they could prevent the shutters being closed and the firm of Earnshaw declared bankrupt. At this juncture, Gordon, one of the eldest clerks, died suddenly. His books were found to be full of artful frauds, false entries, and bad debts. He was a man in whom Stephen Earnshaw had reposed great trust, and bitter was the chagrin of the bluff Englishman when he was shown the defalcations. It was Louis's turn to sneer now, if he had been so minded, but he contented himself with observing to his aunt that her eyes would be opened soon to sights she little expected. Things went on in this unsatisfactory way for some time, when, one day, Stephen Earnshaw ran against an old schoolfellow and early chum whom he hadn't seen for years. Mr. Abbots had lived the greater part of his life abroad. England was almost a new country to him, and he and Earnshaw went into the coffee-room of the Golden Cross Hotel to discuss, over a bottle of wine, the various pranks fortune had played with them. Stephen told his friend the story of his troubles, in which Mr. Abbots deeply sympathized, being a mercantile man himself, and then he, in his turn, recounted the large successes and fortune he had made, especially in the silk trade. "And where have you done all this, old fellow?" questioned Earnshaw. "In Lyons, where I have been resident for years." "In Lyons? Good God! That's where the firm was that has ruined us." "Indeed! May I ask the name?" "Clement and Morel. The scoundrels bolted, goods and all." "Clement and Morel? You are under a delusion, my friend. There is no such firm as Clement and Morel in Lyons, nor has there ever been." "Oh, but there is. We have their acceptances for the whole amount." "I beg your pardon, Earnshaw," replied Mr. Abbots, "for I am acquainted with every firm in the place, and I tell you there has never been such a name as Clement and Morel." An inkling of the truth seemed to dawn on Stephen's mind. He wiped his brow with his handkerchief, gazed at Mr. Abbots for a while in silence, then gasped out, Are you sure?" "Quite sure. I'd stake my life on it." "Then," exclaimed Earnshaw, thumping his stick vehemently on the ground, "then, by heaven, there's been foul play! I knew it all along. Don't say a word, Abbots. I'll be off by tonight's mail. There's some villainy to be cleared up here." He sent a hurried note to Camberwell, begging his sister-in-law not to alarm herself, as he had merely to run over to France for a few days on business. Such an unusual proceeding on his part, however, excited the old lady's apprehension and filled her with consternation. She sent at once for Louis Delbar to see if he knew what it all meant. Louis, however, was as much in the dark as herself. "He's gone mad, Louis!" she cried, wringing her hands. "Trouble and worry have turned his brain. To think of Stephen Earnshaw at his time of life venturing alone among the parlez-vous! Whatever can it all mean?" "He had better have taken someone with him," said Louis, with a faint smile. "What do you think, my dear aunt, if I follow him and bring him home?" "Oh, Louis, by all means do!" exclaimed the excited old lady. "Don't waste a moment, there's a dear boy. I shall be in agony till you both come back." Louis Delbar seemed as anxious as she was for him to be off, and Mrs. Earnshaw lent him a large cloak of her late husband's, as the nights would be very cold, especially on the sea. He waved his light straw hat gaily to her as he passed out of the garden gate, bidding her keep up her spirits, for all would yet be well, her last look beaming kindly on his handsome form and face, the parting sunlight resting on his golden hair. Very dear had the young man become to the childless woman during the years of their acquaintance. She had forgiven him all the past. She only saw the boy she loved, the man she hoped would yet retrieve their fallen fortunes. A few days later, the papers were full of a terrible murder committed in France. The body of a man, horribly mutilated and utterly unrecognizable, was found in a railway carriage on the Lyon route, but no trace of the assassin could be discovered. On the body of the murdered man was a letter addressed by Mrs. Earnshaw to Louis Delbar, the only clue they had to his identity, and when, a short time afterwards, it was placed in her hands, together with the cloak she herself had fastened around his neck, and the straw hat that he wore, now crushed and torn, the grief of the poor woman knew no bounds, and for a while she was lost to consciousness. Dead! In the prime of his youth and life. Dead, murdered on the journey he had taken at her bidding, the boy she loved so dearly, the hope of her declining years. It was long before she recovered from the effects of the fearful shock, a shock great enough to have caused her own death. But, bitter as was her grief, it was made yet more bitter by the continued absence of her brother-in-law. Not a word or sign came from the man who had left her in her trouble, with scarcely a clue to his whereabouts. A terrible suspicion haunted her mind, growing at last into a stern reality. What if the hints dropped by Louis were true? If the man she had trusted had been really robbing her all along, and had left her to enjoy his spoil in a distant land? If so, then that fully accounted for his dislike to Louis, his anxiety not to let him have anything to do with the accounts, as sooner or later he would be sure to find him out. The clerk who died was hand and glove with Stephen, who must have been aware of the false entries in the books. Yes, he had evidently fled with the proceeds of his robbery, but where? The journey to France might be only a pretext. Australia or America were far more likely. Search was made, rewards were offered for his discovery, but all in vain. He was never heard of more, and the weary years rolled on over the plundered widow's head, bringing her slowly but surely to the grave. As she grew older, she became stranger and more eccentric in her habits. Never at any time liking to be thwarted, she would bear no contradiction now. At times moody and silent, at times excitable and imperious, she was ever dwelling on the story of her wrongs, which she related to every newcomer. At last, someone told her that a man, answering in every way the description of her brother-in-law, was living at Clermont-Ferrand, near Lyon, that he was reported to be very rich, but would make friends with nobody. There had been so much mystery about the matter, the failure of the Lyon firm, the fraudulent clerk, the disappearance of Stephen, and the terrible death of the poor boy Louis, that she determined to go to Lyon herself and learn the truth as far as she could. It was vain to dissuade her. Not even the bitter winter, cold as it was, could turn her from her scheme. She was too poor to take a maid, but in her early married days she had often been to Paris with her husband and gained a tolerable knowledge of the French language and railroads. Alone and unprotected, on a freezing January morn, she set out on her weary journey. Arrived at Lyons, she found, to her horror and amazement, that the firm of Clement and Morel had never existed except in imagination. Overcome and bewildered by varied reports and perplexities, she searched through Puy de Dôme and Clermont-Ferrand in vain for any trace of Stephen Earnshaw. From town to town, from village to village she went. Then she heard that an Englishman was living near Geneva who appeared from the description to be the missing man. Nothing daunted, she determined to go to the Lutheran city, and was arranging to leave the hotel when a letter was placed in her hands, covered with various stamps and postmarks, a letter that had followed her into almost every place, lying for some days at different hotels where she had designed to stop. The letter was from a lawyer who stated that her brother White, whom she had long supposed to be dead, had only just died, leaving an immense sum of money to be divided amongst his relatives. She, as one of the next of kin, was entitled to a share, which she would lose if not present in London on a certain day named in the letter. This was enough to startle anyone's nerves. Such an unexpected windfall of good fortune she never anticipated, but the condition to be fulfilled. She looked at the date of the letter. It wanted only 2 days to the time when she must be in London. Travel as fast as she could barely do it. Trembling with excitement, she determined for the time at least to give up her present quest and to return home by the first train from Lyons to Paris. It was a bright, clear morning when she left the fair city of Lyons, and being the only passenger in her compartment, she amused herself with gazing out at the country as they flew along. Snow lay in patches on the broad green fields and crowned the summits of the Jura Alps. The snowy crests glistened and scintillated in the morning sun, raising their lofty peaks into the blue, cloudless sky. As the train flew along on the banks of the Saône, the great wide river glittered like a silver ribbon through the willow trees, while the hills of the Côte d'Or, studded with innumerable white chateaux and picturesque little villages, gleamed reddish gold as the sunlight fell upon them. Very fair looked the beautiful land of France, though in her winter dress. The green of the fields seemed like velvet even now, and the snow, like ermine, bordered the edges of her robe. They flew past Maison, where the now deserted vineyards gave promise of the time when their rich luxuriance would be studded with the deep purple of the grape. Through flat, uninteresting plains, through an open, chalky country, through cuttings where precipitous rocks overhung the deep gorge, shutting the daylight almost out. Past the mountains of Auvergne, up whose arid slopes the desolate vineyards looked cold and drear beneath the wintry sky. Past Sens, its grand cathedral looming against the sky, the clear-cut, perfect Gothic lines standing out in bold relief. Past Chalons-sur-Saône, with its Abbey of St. Marcel. And now the day declines. The sun retires from behind the cold gray clouds, the shadows fall on the mountainsides, wrapping in impenetrable gloom the ruined castles that crown every steep like monuments of ancient feudal times. Out again into the open country, where field after field of tall dank grass is bounded by shivering willow trees, and rows of tall Lombardy poplars, like white sheeted ghosts, bend their ghastly spectre-like forms in the breeze. Puffing and smoking flies the iron horse with a shriek like that of an evil spirit, and now they enter the pleasant valley of Pont-sur-Yonne, its green banks fringed with graceful trees, chateaux and villages studding every slope. It was here, at this station, that the body of the murdered Louis was discovered. In that pretty churchyard he was laid, with the shadow from the spire falling on his grave. Tears dimmed Mrs. Earnshaw's eyes as she gazed out of the train. Oh, if he had but lived to enjoy with her the good fortune that had overtaken her! Her memory went back to the past, when they might have been so happy. As vivid as if only yesterday came the recollection of that fearful time when all her hopes were crushed by her brother's treachery and Louis's cruel death. Thinking of it all, she grew dreamy and tired. The journey had been very long and wearying to her aged limbs. Overcome with sorrow and fatigue, she leant back against the cushions and dropped into a sleep. But even then her imagination would not allow her to rest in peace. Her slumbers were disturbed by her painful thoughts. The face of the murdered man rose before her vision, ghastly and pale, bidding her avenge his death. She started and moaned and could not sleep. A horrible oppression seemed to choke her. A strange sensation as of something unearthly caused her to open her eyes. As she gradually unclosed them, she became aware that she was no longer alone. A form, first indistinct, then horribly real, occupied the seat opposite to her, its eyes fixed on her face. How it got there she did not know. Of how long she had slept or where she was utterly unconscious, but there it sat, that fearful shape, still and quiet, but awfully distinct in the waning daylight. And the eyes, cold, blue, glittering, were the eyes of her dead nephew. A shudder passed over her frame, a cold sweat broke out on her forehead, yet she sat still, fascinated, breathless, glaring at the spectre. As reason began to assert itself, and her half-dazed mind to comprehend the situation, she thought, why should she fear him dead, to whom she had been so kind when living? If that awful something was indeed he, what had she to fear? Yet it was he, without doubt. The fair light hair hung over the marble brow in the way she knew so well, but no smile lurked round the handsome marble mouth. It looked cruel and compressed as the light flitted across it. Its eyes, cold and steely now, wore a lurid, murderous glare. Her heart throbbed audibly, but Mrs. Earnshaw was a brave woman in spite of her age, and she would speak to it, whatever it was. Louis! Horror of horrors! The spectre started from its seat. It was no impalpable form, but a living, breathing man. It was Louis, but Louis alive and well. Who, then, was the murdered man? The truth flashed on her. It was her brother-in-law who had been murdered, and Louis had disguised him in his cloak in order to escape detection. Quick as thought, she flung herself upon him, grasping him around the neck. Warm, soft flesh met her grasp. "Thief! Murderer!" she cried. "I've got you! Villain! I know all! You shan't escape me now!" She clung with all her might and main to the collar of his coat, but the ghost was too strong for her. With one blow and a hissed-out curse, he felled her back into her seat, and another stroke might have silenced her forever, but with a shriek and a yell, the engine rushed into the station of Montereau. Like a tiger-cat, she flew at him again. "Murder! Police! Police!" she cried, as the gendarmes rushed to the window of the carriage and dragged them both out, she still clinging to his coat. "Fools! Dolts!" she exclaimed to the bewildered Frenchman. "Where is your skill? Here is the wretch you supposed to be murdered, but who killed my brother and wrapped his body in my late husband's cloak that I lent him." In vain the malefactor struggled, hound and reptile that he was, to free himself from his captor's hands. A short time sufficed to lodge him in the public prison, while the prefect of police took down the excited old lady's story. They bound her over to appear against Louis Delbarre at the criminal tribunal, and the mayor, a kind-hearted old man, full of compassion for her story and admiration of her intrepidity and courage, himself gallantly offered to accompany her to London. Of what befell her when she arrived there, the reader will be informed further on. Meanwhile, we have to deal with Mr. Toplady's traveling experience. Of the man who traveled in his own coffin. The town of Dudley is pretty familiar to the traveled eye, one that is slowly passing from a sort of old country town cocoon into the dapper, showy, butterfly stage of the bustling railway city. The old fossil of an inn where the coaches used to stop and change, and where the lord and baronets of the district used to dine at size time, had been rudely shouldered aside, elbowed, as it were, into the almshouse by the flaring, splashy, noisy railway hotel, where there was a company, a manager, and a lift. And this substitution was but a type of the human elbowing aside that went on, the old country attorney being tripped up by the go-ahead practitioner, the old humdrum parson by a soft and silvery preacher who floated in on the sweet and scented waters of ritualism, the old traders being driven out by young and rapid merchants, and very lately old Todd, who had brought into the world half the genteel children of the county, and had set one bone at least in the body of every hunting man, was now being seriously threatened by a bright and gorgeous practitioner who had one morning appeared in the place, taken and furnished a handsome house, and was seen careering through the streets in a brougham whose panels shone like looking-glasses. The owner, framed inside, wore jewelry and was scented. The first day he had the air of practice. At least he seemed to be driving about, and even to be letting himself out at hall doors, looking at a notebook, etc., although no particular patient could say he had been visited. The name of this shining and brilliant medical adviser was Redman, Charles Redman, M.D., F.R.C.S.E., and I. Cor. Mem. of R.A.S., etc., in short, the usual medical gold fringe of mysterious lettering, which is an absolute necessity to getting on. The result of this apparition was curiosity at first. Secondly, gratification of this curiosity. One said to the other, "Who's been attending you?" "What, old Todd?" Smile of pity. "We have Dr. Redman, who is charming. Such skill, too. Refused his fee on the second and third visit, saying he only came as a friend. Very different from that greedy old Todd." Comparisons of this sort are particularly odious and also fatal. Dr. Redman could also talk about a Lady Mary. The remark about that greedy old Todd had been made by a member of the community known as Mr. Silas Toplady, an old attorney supposed to have money and spoken of in the handsomest terms invariably used to those who choose to take care of that article. Those metaphors seemed drawn from a carpenter's tool chest. He was an old file, an old screw, a gritty old saw, a mean shaver and parer, a cruel chisel. He lived by himself, an expression faulty as expressing his choice in the matter, whereas the truth was no one could be paid to live with him. He was not exactly one of the typical crusty and rusty misers of the Scrooge mold, but had a knowing and self-satisfied air about him. Neither was he of the traditional age and moldiness, but he was certainly in the worst health and preservation. He was said to be rolling in gold, stuffed with banknotes, an embodiment, in short, of all those curious and rather unnatural processes which popular admiration attaches to wealth. Everyone had this carte de visite of old Toplady, as seen every night at 7 o'clock in the old mouldy coffee-room of the decaying Crown, where he came for his twopennyworth of gin and water. A thin, short, shrunk man with a tailcoat exactly as high-collared as it was short-waisted, and whose trousers were short-legged. Over his head hung his chimney-pot hat, always on the same peg. There his manner was to talk to every stranger on his first appearance, though if that stranger spoke to him cheerfully on their second meeting, he delighted in repulsing him with some remark like, "I think, sir, you and I have not the pleasure of being acquainted." The annoyed stranger would sometimes answer, "God forbid, you curmudgeon!" But old Toplady, though he was only 50-odd, would chuckle and use his favorite phrase, "I put that in his pipe." His coughs, and the sounds of the deranged machinery that accompanied them, with its efforts to get into gear again, were highly unpleasant to the bystanders, but he would never have medical advice, as too costly, and seemed to revel in his coughs and expectoral accompaniments. The go-ahead doctor, being now established in his new go-ahead house with magnificent go-ahead furniture, a go-ahead wife who was fine with daughters, almost at once became curious about this singular medical parishioner. This was the pleasant name he gave to his patients. He called on him, which of course produced no result. Then he happened to be in the coffee-room of the Crown about the hour when old Toplady was having his gin and water, and it was then seen that there was a link between the fine, smooth, agreeable, go-ahead doctor, abstraction made of his clothes and jewelry, and the old miser, abstraction made of his clothes, which might have been an advantage to the parish. On the next night the doctor was there by an accident, and accosted the old miser with great interest as to his health. The other, greatly relishing the opportunity, made his accustomed reply with a sort of chuckle, "I think, sir, you and I have not the honour of being acquainted." But the fluent doctor was not to be so put off. He answered, with his jewelled hand stretched out, "My dear sir, I know that, but we must be, and we shall be, please Providence. I am new to this place. I practice because my heart is in my profession, for the pure love of science. Money, fees as they call them, is no object to me." The other grinned and chuckled. "I can believe that," he said. "You are a man of influence in the place. I hear them all talking and quoting Mr. Silas Toplady. Your name alone would be of inestimable service." "It would, wouldn't it? On my card, eh? Or possibly on a bill, eh?" The doctor was convulsed with laughter at this monetary joke. "You are too much for me, sir," he said. "I come from town, where we are thought shrewd enough, but I find one man here who knows something more. No taking you in, Mr. Toplady. You see through a stone wall." This last compliment, judiciously and artfully put, has an effect upon the human heart which the most adroit would fail of. Tell a man that he is clever, learned, handsome even, and it will be considered a coarse bit of flattery, but let it be, as it were, extorted from us that he can see through a stone wall, and a reluctant and even fatuous smile will steal across his face. At that moment the insinuating doctor had made a conquest of the miser. Would he let him try his skill on that troublesome cough? He owned it was from simply selfish grounds. A cure would be the making of him. When it was known and seen, he would be sent for far and near. "Yes," growled Mr. Toplady, "and send me in a fine bill of fees." "Rather, you will be entitled to charge me for all the fees that will flow in on me. Upon my word, yes, I am serious." The result was very curious. The doctor was, indeed, a sort of Don Giovanni among physicians, almost irresistible when he set himself to enslave a patient. A few nights after, the showy doctor was sitting with his showy wife in their brilliant drawing-room. "He bites, or rather has bitten," says the doctor. "He is the only fish in this beggarly place, a poor hungry spot indeed." "And what will you do with your fish?" "He shall come and live with us, so that I can carry out his cure better." "Come and live with us? That dreadful creature? With our nice house and furniture?" "Our?" repeated the husband, smiling. "There, you mean. It's not paid for by us. He shall pay for it. Yes, we must take him into the house, board and lodge him. He shall pay for all, the brougham, horses, your harp, too, which these beggarly 5-shilling fees never will." Within 3 weeks it actually came about, and the parish were electrified with the news that old Toplady had been taken into the insinuating physician's house for the better superintendence of the cure. He had his little room looking out on the garden, and his own hours. Strange to say, the stupid parish, instead of winking or smiling, rather admired the skill and adroitness of the physician, as though it were part of his medical knowledge. Old Toplady lent himself to the cure with a charming sort of moral helplessness, giving over his somewhat uninviting figure to be dealt with as the doctor pleased. He affably agreed to use the razors left there for him and to assume the suit of more modern clothes that had been ordered for him. He also assumed an agreeable suit of manners and transformed himself into the moneyed old gentleman of the armchair with a sort of Lillyvick deportment, hinting grandiosely at the future dispositions of those magic stocks, funded property, etc., which he was known to possess. To Mrs. Redmond alone was his presence at trial, and she frequently protested against her sufferings, but her husband exhorted her to patience. "It is as certain as that the sun will rise," he said. "I have been over his chest again and again." Here he spoke medically. "The man can't last 6 months more. He's in a galloping consumption. I suppose the bit of lung left to him wouldn't cover—" and the doctor looked about for some convenient standard. "Half that envelope." "You said that 4 months ago," she answered touchily. "No, my dear, it was double that size then. All in good time. With the stethoscope for lead and line we can gauge every hill and hollow, and all in good time. In my desk is a full disposition of his means, with the exception of that £1,000 to the consumptive hospital." "What absurdity!" she said. "A pampered, overgrown place, a set of impostors." "Hang the consumptive hospital, my dear," he said. "But all in good time. I don't despair of upsetting them yet." The doctor was a good medical man, and a good medical prophet as well. Long remembered in the parish was the momentous night when it went abroad that old Toplady was at his last. It was almost at his last also, in a social way, with the doctor himself. Bills had been pressing for the unpaid-for furniture, not only bills, but demands couched in that brief and hostile tone of threat which is peculiar to the letter-writer whose request has been neglected or evaded. The truth was the doctor's descent in the place was by way of speculation or coup de main. He was to subdue the whole county by a week's battle, but he had failed. After the first shock, the older doctor had made a rally. Things were looking ugly for the invading general, and it was curious that the doctor's affairs and the health of his guest should have decayed pan passu, as it were, at precisely the same descending rate. So that actually both came to a crisis together, and when the unhappy miser was reduced to his last shred of lung, his attendant had received notice that a new legal drama would be enacted in his house, and that the playbill, as it were, was to be placed in the sheriff's hand next day. Unhappy old Toplady, whose case, but for certain circumstances, might deserve pity, was at his last. The doctor saw it was time. "My dear friend, you must now make ready to—" I know," said the sick man. "If you have any anything to change or revoke, any more worthy object than that consumptive hospital already lavishly endowed, and from which you have derived no advantage, a selfish community notoriously so eager for your death." The other turned his face over, and in a husky voice, but still with the same curious expression, one of enjoyment almost, said, "What would you like? They shan't have it." "My dear sir," said the doctor, bringing over paper, pens, and ink, all laid handy and convenient, "a short codicil which I shall draft." "Don't give yourself the trouble," the other said, still more hoarsely. He was going fast. "It is yours now, or any man's." "Stupid," muttered the doctor. "But the will, my dear friend, it is in the will with the other property." "Yours also," he said, still more faintly, "or any man's." These strange words, thus repeated twice, disturbed the doctor, for at first he had taken it something after the way a race is said to be any man's race. This scene took place past midnight. After this he fell into a sort of doze, which lasted till daylight. The doctor left him and was much out of patience. About 8 o'clock he went in again to the patient's room, who was now very near his end. "You feel better, my dear friend," said the hypocritical doctor. "Oh, of course," said the other in a sort of wheeze. At that moment someone brought in the morning letters, a whole sheaf of bills which might have had their items written outside, so unmistakable was the blue paper, the formal round hand and flourishes, and the seal. He tossed them aside impatiently. Another sort of envelope had the word attorney written on its outside, as plain as paper and seal and handwriting could make it. This he would have tossed aside as impatiently, but that it was directed to Silas Toplady, Esquire, in great haste, to be forwarded, most important. He read it, and gave a cry of joy and astonishment as he read, then rushed upstairs to the sick man's room, flourishing it like a banner. "Such news!" he cried. "Listen to this. This will bring you to life, my dear friend." And he read out the following: 1 Taffy's Inn, High Holborn, December 31st, 1868. Sir, I beg to acquaint you that your name appears on the list of legatees in the will of the late Isaac White of Lowtide Street, Riverside, West Strand, London, and that by the wording of the deceased will all his properties, amounting to £20,000 18 shillings and 3 pence, will be equally divided among those present, and among them only, at the residence of the late Mr. White above mentioned, on the 31st of January next, at the hour of 6 p.m. precisely. Begging you, therefore, to attend personally, and on no account to neglect this communication, I am your obedient servant, Samuel Badger. The other's eyes were turned to the letter with a strange eagerness. He could not follow the verbiage, but he had an instinct it was about money. He half raised himself. "What is it?" he said hoarsely. "Can't you be plain?" "It is left to you, my dear friend, and oh!" A sudden idea. His eyes wandered over to the pen and ink always ready in that room. "Oh, dearest friend, if you would but, now that the threshold of eternity is opening—" But the change in the sick man was remarkable. He tossed about, clutched his hands wildly. "To come now! To come now!" he gasped. "What am I to do? It could have gone in an annuity. Give it me. Let me see it. I shall live to have my own money." "My dear friend, you shall, if we can help it. But in the meantime, a short codicil. It is incumbent on you, a duty." "To die now that I have money?" "Now that he has money," said the doctor uneasily. What can he mean? "But I implore you, my dear friend, thus on the threshold of—" There was a gurgle in the dying man's throat. He was trying to say something of an anity. "Eternity, my dear friend?" "An annuity." He turned over and died. Ruling passion is strong in death, thought the doctor, looking at him pityingly. Annuity his eternity. But before noon he had found there was more sense than he dreamed of in that last word and dying speech. Ransacking the papers, he found that there was nothing left to them of the old miser but the mortal remains. His pecuniary substance had taken flight with his soul and bore the fatal shape of an annuity. But the new legacy, it was enough to turn him frantic. There was consternation in the house, agitated councils, and secret packing. The game was up. The doctor was preparing to cut, and he made these preparations a strange recitative of malediction to the dead miser upstairs. The worst was, he was expected to go through the formalities of poignant grief and assume the bearing of a successful legatee. A handsome funeral was expected. but it was to be strictly private. "I'd give him a pauper's funeral," said the doctor as the undertaker left him, "and rattle his bones well for him." Then, as his eye fell on the lawyer's letter, he burst into a fury. "To lose all this, such a legacy! It would have paid all. One thing is a satisfaction. He won't be at the gathering of hungry relations. Someone else wants his company. No, you old robber, you shan't make one of the legatees. Or, wait." He grew thoughtful, reflected a long time, and, with a gleam of savage humor in his eye, went his way. Mrs. Redmond had the reputation of being a magnificent performer on the harp, though no one had ever heard any of her witching strains. Still, the instrument stood there, a majestic, Gothic, unpaid-for Erard, a sort of glorified abstraction of the idea, shoulder, sometimes moodily wrapped in its leathern paletot as if expecting a heavy shower, sometimes in grande tenue, blazing in gold and satinwood, regarded with awe, but still untouched with a vestal reverence. Its wooden packing-case lay prone in the garden. The doctor ordered coachman and footman to bring it up, saying the harp was a take-in. "They have palmed off one of their inferior things on us, and she'll have to go back to them." That night the case lay on the carpet in the drawing-room, quarters of unaccustomed luxury, while another sort of case, recently introduced, lay in an upper chamber. That night, too, Dr. Redmond scarcely lay at all. The next morning Messrs. Chuckford's great wagon and Messrs. Chuckford's men came to take the case to the London and North Western Railway, and the Messrs. Chuckford's men pronounced that it were the heaviest harp they'd ever hoisted on a wagon. A great card nailed on it was directed to Joseph Badger, Esquire, solicitor, with an inscription, "Not to be opened save in the presence of the assembled legatees." This was duly read by Chuckford's men, but caused no more surprise than would an odd epitaph to a gravedigger. They had an equal experience with their packing cases and their inscriptions. At the gloomy lunch that day, for the next morning would be the day of the funeral and the arrival of the sheriff's men, etc., Dr. Redmond, with a certain grim humor, said to his wife, "I shall post this tomorrow, and it will reach on the morning the legatees assemble. The greedy souls will think there's money to come to them. I would give £50. "A bill for £50, you mean?" his wife said scoffingly. "Why, a better plan would have been to have gone and claimed the money. You have no scruples." Dr. Redmond started up with a cry. "Oh, fool!" This was addressed to himself. "I should have thought of that." "There are plenty of things you should have thought of. Why, you were considered like him. It would pass without question, and you know he was your dear friend and would have left it to you." "Such an idea! Dolt! Stupid donkey!" said the physician, still addressing himself. "It's too late now. The thing has gone off." "Stop it, then." "It can't be. It's booked through and will only be delivered to the consignee." "Well, you have a head," she said, contemptuously, though doubtful of the matter. "And if you can't see a way to getting back your property or my harp case, you must be in a poor way." He hesitated. "I declare I'll make the attempt," he said. "It's worth it." "But the funeral? The remains?" she said, with a motion of her head upstairs. "Well," he said, with a grin, "I do go after the remains. Remains, indeed, I've no patience with him. Carcass is the only fitting word." The next morning the miser was buried unostentatiously, though everyone wondered at the absence of the chief mourner. He was set down as being arrogant, bloated with his new riches, infernal ungrateful. It was set down, besides, as being bad taste. The harp case had been consigned to a luggage train which had started off at midnight on the mournful, skulking, undignified, slouching course, the tramp and vagrant of the line, odious and a burden to all, unpleasant to station masters who, with contempt, good nature, and pity mixed, seemed to deal with it, much as a fine lackey would with a mean friend who wanted to slip through the hall without being seen by the master. "Now then, you get along quick. There's a chance for you now, or you'll be caught." On the back of such a wretched pariah, a burden to itself from its mere length, a crawling, jingling, rickety sort of centipede, sneaking up to a station or cowering at some miserable siding until the express went by, was laid what was called the arpkiss. The luggage train, the arpkiss of course included, was under the charge of 3 officers, Tom, Bob, and Jack. Tom the guard, Bob the driver, and Jack the stoker. During their progress, Tom the guard led a Trappist's life in his brake van, Bob and Jack being about a quarter of a mile away in front of the engine. The train heavy one, and the arpkiss was very large, so its end projected a good deal, and it was a very awkward customer to load and put away. Indeed, Tom, Bob, and Jack had many colloquies over it, Tom being uneasy, as it seemed, to spoil the symmetry of his train. "Ugh, I'm ashamed on it," he said in disgust. "It's getting more and more eyesore every moment, bulging here, bulging there." He grew so affected that at the next convenient stoppage, they were skulking for their lives from an overdue express, an attempt was made to adjust the symmetry of this unlucky package, and they then found that the weight was so utterly abnormal that they could not stir it without a general disturbance. Tom the guard declared that many was the rard arpkiss he had fixed, and you could lift 'em all like babbies. However, the luggage had to halt here for 2 hours, owing to a block on the line from about half a dozen expresses, which were to dart about and cross each other like plinkins in a pool. At this crisis, Tom, Bob, and Jack, their train drawn close and skulking under a bridge, as it were, saw a gentleman wrapped in a cloak come over to them from the refreshment room and accost them all 3. Jack, the stoker, was busy wiping the many noses of his engine, which seemed each to have a heavy and oily cold. "There's a mistake here," said the gentleman. "A case sent forward which ought not to go on." "Which?" says Tom the guard. There it is," said the gentleman eagerly, touching the protuberance with his umbrella. "That harp case, it must—" "Bucked through," said the guard. "On the bill. Can't without orders." "Oh, nonsense. It must, my man. You have no red tape on you, I know." Tom the guard came up to him. "That's an arpkiss, is it?" he said significantly. "Sure? Cocksure?" The gentleman looked red. "Of course it is. Any fool could see that." "But is it an arp that's inside?" The gentleman grew more red still and turned away. He went to the station master, who told him nothing could be done. The gentleman got in a passion. "It's absurd," he said. "Dragging my property away from me at this rate. Precious circumlocution manager you are." "I know my business and my duty, and I tell you what, mister, I doubt if you have any business with the case at all. Trick's been tried on us before now." The gentleman turned away confused. Meantime the block continued. They could not get the line clear. The luggage train, articulated, bending and jointed like a spine, got out a little, but had to come back, backing with precipitate haste, not a second too soon. "They near had us that time," said Tom, as the Northern Express tore by them. "Back her a bit now into the shed. There ain't 6 inches to spare. It's too fine." She was backed into the shed, but the bulging harp case struck a pillar. "That stirred it," as Jack said, and made it symmetrical at last. The three sat down together to wait better times, the engine's various noses being wiped with rags, and with unwearied good temper on the stoker's part, who would have made an excellent child's nurse. Each lit his pipe, but as the match was being drawn across the case end, Bob saw something glitter. "Cold by the 11s!" he cried. They all jumped up. A splinter had been broken by the collision, and gold was certainly gleaming. What was it? Bob took his knife and prized off the splinter. He gave a cry. "I knew it, boys, and I've never weighed that. It's the platings of a coffin." They all came and looked at it, and looked at each other. Each was thinking of the man and his eagerness. "He's done it," said Tom. "It's it," said Bob. "There's a reward out," says Jack. Each whistled, and Tom, whose rank gave him leadership, withdrew. He returned with the police. Those officers at once pronounced the case suspicious, drew out their dark lanterns, and, after a prolonged examination, pronounced, as an original discovery of their own, "Why, this is a coffin!" Almost at the instant of this declaration, a man was seen coming up softly, wrapped in a cloak. The others drew the policeman back into the shadow. "Look here now, my good fellows, you are men of sense, and I dare say men of the world also. Now, I want that case, and I must have it. We know, of course, that it's against the rules and all that, but how much, my men? We understand each other?" "But I say," said Jack, cunningly and slowly, "before we come to that, what sort of thing might it be inside now? You know it ain't an arp, nor a rard one neither." The other hesitated. He could trust them. "Well, it's not. It's a piece of marble, a sculpture, you know." "Oh, maybe a starter? A figure?" "Precisely. So now, my men, name your terms." A bullseye was suddenly flashed upon him, and the policeman's hand was on his collar. "It won't do," said the latter. "It's all up. Case strong against you. Arrest you under suspicious circumstances." The man staggered back. It was suspicious. He was faltering out something when they, all there, heard a strange and hurried tapping near them. They looked around. It was heard again. Their faces turned pale. "Why," one faltered, "if it ain't in the coffin." On that signal they all fled with a cry, save for the guard, who returned and who cried, "Come back! There's a man in it! Quick, where's a hatchet?" They paused. The police alone exhibited hesitation. In a moment the arpcus was down, stove open, and a true coffin revealed. And in another moment any promiscuous undertaker would have been scandalized at seeing a nice and costly bit of his workmanship hewn into splinters. Old Silas, in a third moment, was sitting up and staring at them. Such is the wonderful force of the ruling passion that he had strength to rally a little, and in his husky voice ordered himself to be carried to Old White's house. What he found there will appear further on. Are you guys seeing how I feel like the vibe of this series is a murder mystery, even though there's not really a murder and no mystery? I mean, this story had a murder, but it's not really central to the plot. I am so glad Mrs. Earnshaw showed some spunk at the very end. For a while I could kind of feel her shrinking and declining into just being a resentful old woman, but instead she went out and she caught the thief. Lovely. Good for her. As for the second story, I love it. I mean, the characters are incredibly unlikable, but also incredibly plausible, and the doctor should obviously seek advice from his wife more often and earlier. That whole closing scene with the railroad guys and the cops and the man fresh from the coffin at the side of the train tracks in the dead of night, amazing! That terrible moment of misgiving when the coffin starts to make noise. Brilliant! And what do you think of the author's observation that a seemingly grudging compliment is more persuasive than straight flattery? As I mentioned in part 1, I'm going to leave the research and the backstory on Tinsley's Christmas Annual until the end of this series. So, if you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. Tonight's confession is that I have had all my Christmas cards made for a couple of weeks now, and I still haven't mailed them. Mostly because you used to be able to go to the Primera or something and have them weighed and get a postage sticker and go about your business. Now you have to do all of it online. And I have the nerve to want to send a package to somebody in the States, so I have to fill out the customs declaration, and I already know that nothing will reach the US before Christmas anyway. And that's fine. I mean, people are kind of expecting it from me by now. But also, I have gotten sick and I just have not been able to get it together to go out in the rain the past couple of days and mail them. I really do have to get it done soon, though. It's becoming a crisis. Also, my cards this year are really cute. I made them, but I based them on printouts of weird old Victorian cards that are just kind of strange and dark and unexpected. I'm feeling pretty strange and dark this year, so it seems fitting. But it won't be fitting at all if they don't arrive sometime around the holiday season. If you like weird old stories and you're not too bothered about punctuality, you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel now so you never miss a story. Please also consider giving me a like or dropping me a comment below to help other people find the channel. And if you'd like to help me out even more, use the link in the description to buy me a cup of coffee. Thank you for all the support, and I will see you in a few days.